Good morning and welcome to Virtual Sunday School with Morrilton First Presbyterian Church. I'm Pastor Ainsley, and today we are continuing our study on Faces of Faith. So today we are looking at Mark chapter 14, and we are going to be studying the story of Judas. So that's a little bit different than some of the ones that we've been studying so far. Judas is a pretty controversial character. So I won't be reading it word for word because the story goes on for about half of chapter 14, which is about 50 verses. But I encourage you to go ahead and read it for yourself after you finish this video, or you can pause it and read it now. And also, if you want to, go ahead and look at Judas's story in the other Gospels. It's told a little bit different in every Gospel, but I'll go ahead and summarize it for you. So at the beginning of chapter 14, we learn that Jesus is already in Jerusalem. It's the week of Passover, just a few days before he's going to be crucified. And so it says that the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for a way that they could arrest Jesus and have him killed, and they wanted to do it quietly because they were afraid of the people who followed him rioting. So then Jesus goes to Bethany, which is very close to Jerusalem, and he is at the house of Simon the leper, and a woman comes with a jar of perfume, and she pours it over his head and anoints him. And people say, why are you letting her waste this? That money could have been spent on the poor. And Jesus talks about how it's a beautiful thing that she did for him, and that she anointed him and prepared him for his burial that's to come. And then immediately after, it says in verse 10, "Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over." And then we have the story of the Last Supper, which happens on the first day of the Passover feast, and Jesus gathers his disciples and shares a meal with them. This is where the sacrament of communion comes from. And then Jesus predicts Peter's denial, and then they all go out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus prays at Gethsemane, and the disciples, of course, fall asleep. And then he comes back, finds them sleeping, wakes them up, and then Judas comes with the chief priests, and he betrays them. That's when it says, "Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. So that's kind of the end of that story. Later on, when Judas sees what happened to Jesus, he ends up hanging himself. See, that's told a little bit differently in the different Gospels. So like I said, I encourage you to read that whole story for yourself. It's a little long, but Judas's story is really interesting because I think that Judas is a lot more complex than a lot of us realize. We kind of think of him as this very two-dimensional character, this man who he betrayed Jesus, and he's just this evil guy who, didn't really care about Jesus, which is very two-dimensional. He's the bad guy. He's, greedy, or he was a fake. He didn't really love Jesus, didn't really believe anything Jesus taught. So we see him in a very two-dimensional way, and I think Judas is a lot more complex than that. We have to remember that Judas spent probably 3 years traveling with Jesus and listening to him And, well, you don't devote 3 years of your life to something that you don't believe in. And he traveled with him. He gave up everything to follow Jesus. And Judas was one of Jesus's closest friends. He was his disciple. He was his confidant. The 12 disciples were very close with Jesus, and they all loved him very much. And so it's a little bit confusing, really, to figure out why exactly Judas betrayed him. Because it's not just that Judas wanted the money, or that Judas just had a lot of hate in his heart and wanted to kill Jesus. It's a lot more complex than that, and there's a lot of different theories about why exactly Judas did it, and none of us can really know that for sure until we get to ask God ourselves. But there's a few different theories. There's one theory that says that Jesus actually planned it out with Judas because he knew that he had to be handed over to the chief priest to die. And so he told Judas to betray him. So that's one theory. You can take that however you want. But there's a few others that I think have a little bit more weight to them, and they have to do with fear. So the thing is that Jesus was stirring up a lot of people, that people were excited for the Messiah. They've been waiting for hundreds of years for the Messiah to come, and they were waiting because they believed that the Messiah was going to be this great military figure. The Messiah means anointed one, and there were actually other people known as messiahs. So King David was known as a messiah because he was anointed by God's prophet Samuel. And so David was this big military leader, and Jesus is David's descendant. He's the anointed Messiah, and so people are expecting something like David. And so Jesus comes along, and he's preaching peace and all of these things, but people are still expecting, especially when he comes in the triumphant entry on Palm Sunday, and they're expecting, okay, this is it. Now Jesus is going to raise up an army, and we're all going to rebel against the Romans, and we're going to free ourselves, and we'll have our own nation again, and we'll be free of any oppressive ruler. So that's what the people are expecting. And so the people are getting stirred up, and they're getting a little crazy, especially during the week of Passover, what we now know as Holy Week among Christians. They're getting a little riled up and everything. And so there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of fear among the chief priests and the teachers of the law because they enjoyed a place of privilege among Jews. That the Jews were fairly oppressed by the Romans, as were most of the places that the Romans occupied. They didn't have a lot of rights, but people, the political and religious leaders, like the chief priests, they enjoyed a little bit more privilege. And so that privilege depended on them keeping the Jews under control and making sure that the Jews didn't riot. And so the priests were very against the Messiah coming and riling up the people and stirring up a rebellion, because they knew that chances were the Jews weren't going to win. There had already been several fake messiahs who had tried to start rebellion, and it had failed, and the Romans had cracked down on them, and things didn't go well for the Jews. And so the chief priests are very afraid of that happening again. They don't want Jesus to do that because they don't want to lose their place in society and all of the privileges that they enjoy. And so they're just afraid. They're afraid of that happening. And so there's one theory that says that's what Judas was afraid of too. I don't know if you've seen the musical Jesus Christ Superstar. I'm personally not a huge fan of that musical. But one thing that it does right, I think, is that it captures that fear that Judas might have had, that Jesus was going to stir things up and that the Romans were going to crack down on them. And so that's one that's one theory for why Judas ultimately betrayed Jesus. Another theory is that Judas was afraid for himself. He knew that the chief priests were looking to arrest Jesus, that people were after him, and that anyone who followed Jesus would be a target as well and might be executed as well. And so Judas was afraid for his own life, and so out of fear he decided to protect himself and put his life ahead of Jesus's. And so he went to the chief priests so that when they came for Jesus and all his followers, he would be safe and he wouldn't be caught up with all the rest. So that's another theory. There's also a theory that says Judas didn't, it kind of goes along with the other ones, Judas didn't know that Jesus was going to die. And so maybe he was afraid for his life, maybe he was afraid of what the Romans were going to do. But he thought that, Jesus might be locked up and something would happen that would stop him from stirring up trouble, from anything happening, but he didn't know that Jesus was going to die. And so after the crucifixion, we learn that Judas regretted it so much that he returned the money that he was given by the chief priest for betraying Jesus, and then he hanged himself because he just could not live with what had happened. And so I think it's very likely actually that Judas didn't realize, and so that's why he was filled with so much regret that he took his own life. So there's a lot of different theories, but I think that ultimately what it comes down to is that Judas didn't do it out of greed or out of hatred or anything like that. I think Judas betrayed Jesus out of fear. I think that he gave in to the fear and he ended up doing something that he greatly regretted. And of course, we know that it ended up being for the good of the entire world and all the people in it, but Judas didn't know that at the time, and so he gave in to fear and did something that he horribly regretted, and then he couldn't live with that regret anymore. He couldn't live with himself, knowing that this friend, this teacher that he loved so much, that he'd followed for 3 years and learned so much from, that he had caused this man's death, and there was a lot of regret there. And so I think it did ultimately come down to fear. Maybe, I'm not sure what kind of fear it was that motivated him, but some kind of fear led him to doing that. And so today, as we close, I invite you to think about a time in your life when you've given in to fear, and a time that fear has led you to do something that you greatly regret. Maybe not as great as what Judas did, but I think we all have times in our life when we let fear take over. We don't trust in God. We don't trust that God is in control and, has a plan and all of that, and that things will eventually work out. And so we get so afraid that we do things that we regret. I know that I definitely have. So take some time to think about that, and maybe write down some stuff. Just journal like you're writing a letter to God, talking about that regret that you have, and just give that up to God, because God doesn't want us to live with those regrets. I don't think that God wanted Judas to live with that regret, and that had, that Judas, could have lived and could have been forgiven had he not been so overwhelmed with that regret. I know that's a very controversial topic there, but just spend some time, journaling or praying and just talking to God about that time that you gave into fear and how you regret it, And just give that regret up to God and ask God to take that burden off your shoulders, because God doesn't want us to live with regret. That's what God's mercy and forgiveness is for, so that we don't have to live with the things that in our past that burden us and weigh us down. So take some time today to talk to God about those things. And now let's close in prayer. Holy God, may your love fill us with the courage to turn away from fear and turn toward you. Amen. Bye, everybody.